Right in, and we'll try and cover a lot of difficult territory quickly, because I know that it is getting late and we want to have an opportunity for discussion. If the economic commentators are to be believed, there is at least one lesson from the seemingly never-ending euro crisis, and that is that monetary union without fiscal union is unsustainable. Canada is a monetary union, but are we still a practicing fiscal union? Or has our fiscal union become so weakened that we are now more like the Eurozone, 10 more or less sovereign provinces tied together in a monetary union without effective programs to compensate adequately for fiscal imbalance between the provinces? And by the way, territories are a slightly different category, so we'll just set them aside for now and speak of the provinces. Canada is among the most decentralized federations in the developed world. Unlike most federations, our provinces are sovereign in their own areas of jurisdiction, meaning that the federal government cannot override provincial laws. Perhaps more importantly, though, the provinces also have sovereign taxing power and the ability to tap all significant tax sources. This wasn't the original idea. In our original constitution, in the British North America Act, the idea was to give the federal government fiscal supremacy because they alone could levy indirect taxes, which are mainly customs duties. And at the time, custom duties were the overwhelming source of revenue. But of course, as you all know, things didn't turn out quite as planned. They rarely do. Custom duties have become trivial, and they're becoming more trivial in the modern world. In contrast, provinces have sole access to almost all the revenue derived from selling the rights to exploit natural resources. Natural resources have turned into such a significant source of revenue that provinces in aggregate likely now have greater fiscal capacity than the federal government. But provincial resource revenue is extremely unevenly distributed. This uneven distribution of a major source of revenue compounds already unequal economic levels among the provinces, making it doubly difficult for the federal government to address fiscal imbalances, if it had the will to do so. There are two main ways in which a fiscal union may offset fiscal imbalances among its constituent states. In Canada, that means the provinces. By increasing the size of the federal state relative to overall GDP, and thereby minimizing the importance of the constituent states. Or secondly, by directly transferring money from the federal government to the constituent states proportionate to their fiscal requirements. With respect to the size of the central government first, that is the first way to mitigate fiscal imbalance. This is a interesting figure. In Canada, in 2010-11, the fiscal year, excluding transfers to provinces and debt charges, federal spending amounted to only 11.4% of GDP. That's right down. Whoops, that's not going to work. All right, I'll just not do that. The red line is excluding debt servicing charges, federal expenditures. The yellow line is including debt services charge. I put them down both because I wasn't sure if you want to look at the size of the federal government relative to GDP, should you or should you not include debt servicing charges. But either way, the story is about the same. Figure 1 shows total federal expenditures as a percentage of GDP on programs and transfers to persons, that is the yellow line, from 1983-84 through 2010. 2010-11 reflects an upward spike, as you can see, due to the recession beginning in late 2008. But as you can also see, if I could use my marker on this thing, I could show you, there was also a spike of that kind in the recession of the 1990s, which turned out to be temporary. The bump in 2010-11 will almost certainly also turn out to have been temporary. But despite these upticks, even if you include them statistically, the trend has obviously been downward. With the trend line, Ottawa's spending on programs and transfers to person would likely be somewhere less than 10% of GDP today. In my view, this is a matter of normative judgment, but in my view, this is too small to make a significant contribution to constraining fiscal imbalance. If it was 40% of GDP, that would make a big difference. But what about the second mechanism? Federal transfers. The second mechanism, federal transfers, may directly assist less well-off provinces so that their fiscal capacity is more equal to that of wealthier provinces. Figure 2 shows federal transfers to other governments from 1983-84 to 2010-11. The pattern is almost identical to federal expenditures in Figure 1. That is, it shows that federal expenditure, that there's a downward trend with 2 upticks during the recessions. But what it ends up as is in 2010-11, federal transfers to other governments equaled about 3.3% of GDP in Canada. And if 2010-11 were on the trend line, it would be lower. Federal transfers would be somewhere around 3% of GDP. I should mention that when I speak of federal transfers, I mean all transfer programs. Equalization, Canada Health Transfer, Canada Social Transfer, the transfers that are implicit in the labor market development agreements, and several minor other transfers as well. So with federal spending of 10%, while federal spending of 10% of GDP is too small to have a meaningful impact on fiscal imbalance, 3% of GDP spent on direct transfers to provinces could potentially have an impact. And I want to take a minute to explain this. If we think of fiscal imbalance roughly as the ratio for each province of fiscal capacity divided by GDP, then federal spending affects the denominator, GDP, which is a big number, while federal transfers affect the numerator, fiscal capacity, which is a smaller number. So unlike federal spending, which we anticipate, unlike federal spending, which we would anticipate would be spent more or less equally in all the provinces, we would anticipate exactly the opposite for federal transfer payments. In other words, we'd expect that federal transfer payments to provinces, a lot of P's, payments to provinces, are efficient in addressing fiscal imbalances in that transfers would be heavily skewed towards those provinces with lesser fiscal capacity. Consequently, although federal transfers to provinces are a small and decreasing percentage of GDP, they might still be important in offsetting fiscal imbalances if the transfer system is efficient and well targeted. So, is it? I'm going to do a little reminiscence because that's the part of being at a 20th anniversary. In 1981, I had the great privilege of working on the research staff of a parliamentary task force, the Parliamentary Task Force on Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements. That's when we still had a parliament. We were in a panicky rush to complete the final version of our report, which is called Fiscal Federalism in Canada, and I know there's a few people in here who've seen it. When it occurred to me at this sort of last minute, late at night, to ask whether the per capita federal transfers of the day were inversely proportional to the per capita GDP of the provinces, meaning bigger per capita transfers go to the provinces with lower per capita GDP? It seems like an obvious question, and I suppose it is, but oddly enough, though we have been working night and day for about 4 months, no one had thought previously of asking it. Fiscal arrangements in 1981 were much more complex than today. There was a Canada Assistance Plan, which a few of you might remember, RIP, paid provinces half of spending on welfare. Another act, Vocational Rehabilitation for Disabled Persons Act, paid for many social services for persons with disabilities. Established programs. Financing Act is more complicated, and on and on. And of course, Equalization, I should mention, was a wholly formula-driven program in its sort of prime. And in addition, there were a lot of smaller transfer programs in those days. Almost all of these have subsequently disappeared or morphed. What I did in 1981 was add up the total per capita transfer of the sum of all these transfer programs for each province, and then I plotted the result on a scatter diagram against looking at the per capita transfer plotted against the per capita GDP of each province. And then I used a hand calculator, state of the art, to calculate the best fitting trend line. And lo and behold, it was with a great deal of surprise that not only I, but the other research staff saw that the per capita transfers to the provinces fell almost perfectly on a straight line, with the poorer provinces getting a much greater per capita transfer and the richest provinces much less. It turns out that in 1981, we could have taken all these complicated transfer programs and substituted a simple formula based on per capita provincial GDP for the whole mixed bag of transfer payment arrangements, and affected almost no change at all in the amount paid to each province, which isn't to say that there wouldn't have been changes in other respects, like the conditions under which the provinces had to receive the funding, but the amounts would have been the same. This showed, as the task force concluded at the time, that the, quote, system of federal provincial transfers achieves a substantial degree of redistribution. It also showed that the provinces were treated equitably in that the total per capita transfer in each province was equally proportionate to its per capita GDP. That was in 1981. So I've asked myself this question: does today's system of federal provincial transfers still achieve a substantial degree of redistribution? And is the system still equitable among the provinces? Or to put the same question in another way, is our small but non-trivial federal provincial transfer system fair and efficient in addressing fiscal imbalance? To answer this question, we need to be able to measure the fairness and efficiency of the transfer system. So excuse me for being a little bit technical here, but it's worth it, I hope. Using per capita GDP as a proxy for fiscal capacity, the fairness of the transfer system may be measured by the extent to which every province is treated the same relative to its per capita GDP. An index for this, a way to measure it, is the fit of what we call a linear trend line when per capita GDP of each province is plotted against each of their total per capita transfers. So how do we measure this fit? There's a measure called the R squared, and it can vary from 1 to 0. 1 is a perfect fairness in that each province's per capita GDP predicts exactly its per capita transfer, and 0 is perfect unfairness, so to speak. I'm not sure if there is such a thing, but there it is, where per capita GDP is simply no relationship at all to per capita transfers. So I'm going to give you an example now before I tell you what has happened in the Canadian system over the last 20-odd years, 30 years. The figure 3 uses 1987. I just picked the year as an arbitrary selected year to illustrate these measures. The trend line fits the data quite closely, and the R squared, as you can see, I put it in sort of extra bold. R squared is 0.83, that 0.83. So in other words, this means that the variation in per capita provincial GDP explains 83% of the variation of per capita transfers in each province. That's a pretty high number, leaving only 17% to other factors. You can see if you look, Newfoundland right at the end is a little above the trend line, meaning that its per capita federal transfers were higher in 1987 than the trend given other provinces' per capita GDP. On the other hand, BC is lower, implying that its transfers were lower than the trend line. So relative to this measure of fairness, the Newfoundland got a little more, BC got a little less, but not that much less. And Manitoba is right in the middle. It's right on the trend line. No province, as I've noted, is very far from the trend line. So that's what the R squared looks at, how close they are to the trend line. Turning to the efficiency of the transfer system, how do we measure that? The efficiency is how much redistributive impact can be obtained from any given amount that is spent. The slope of the trend line is a way to measure the extent of redistribution. If you have a flat trend line paying the same amount to each province, regardless of its per capita GDP, obviously you don't have any redistribution. And if you have a steeply sloped line paying much more to poorer provinces, then you have significant redistribution. So let's look at figure 3 again as an example. I've bolded the slope. This is just a simple, very simple statistical method. The equation that's shown in the box, federal per capita transfers to the province equals minus 1.35 times provincial per capita, etc., describes the best fit trend line of federal per capita transfers in 1987. I hope you're paying attention because there will be a test. This means that for each dollar, what this means, it's very concrete actually, although it looks, fancy. It means that for each dollar of additional per capita GDP in a province, federal per capita transfers would be reduced by 13.5% to the extent that you're following the trend line. 13.5 cents, did I say? 13.5 cents. So for each dollar of additional GDP. This is the slope of the trend line. The bigger the slope, the more redistributive are the fiscal arrangements. So we can use the slope of the trend line as a reasonable way to measure the redistributive efficiency of fiscal arrangements, meaning how much correction of fiscal imbalance do we get for our transfer dollars. Using these two measures, it is possible to provide a picture of how fiscal arrangements have changed over time in Canada. Figure 4 shows the equity of the federal transfer payments among the provinces from 1983 through 2009. That is, it shows the R squared for each year over time. Until 1995, as you can see, Canada's fiscal arrangements were highly equitable between provinces. In fact, it almost hits 90% at one point, with more than 80% of variation between provinces explained by variation in per capita GDP for the whole preceding decade. But beginning in 1996 and accelerating in 2000, everything changed. The equity of the system deteriorated rapidly until today. There is essentially no relationship at all. We've hit 0.02, not 0.2, but 0.02 at one point. No relationship at all between each province's per capita GDP and federal transfers to the province. To put it graphically, equity fell off a cliff. You can see the cliff there, and it has not bounced back. Now there is a little bit of movement at the end there, but it's hard to know how much of that is attributable simply to a great drop in GDP and the very significant drop in GDP per capita, particularly in Alberta and Newfoundland, due to just the price of oil, probably transient. What about, that's the measure of fairness. What about the extent of redistribution in the system over time? That's shown in Figure 5. Redistribution has not fared much better in the last 25 years. Figure 5 just shows the slope of the trend line for each year from 1983 through to 2009. The fiscal arrangements had become steadily more redistributive in the 1980s, as you can see, sort of climbing up in the 1980s, achieving a plateau of sorts in the first half of the 1990s, only to begin decreasing rapidly and reaching new lows in the first decade of the 2000s. There was a spike upward in 2009, but again, we really won't understand that spike upward until we can see another few years of data, which, by the way, aren't available yet. These are from the provincial economic accounts available on CanSim for those who are interested. I just picked a few of the last years as to show you what this means more tangibly for each province in 2008 and 2009. Right slide? No, I'm sorry, I went up one, two. Right. Okay, so Figure 6 and 7. This can be seen tangibly on Figures 6 and 7, which show the distribution of federal per capita transfers to provinces against per capita provincial GDP, just as you saw previously in Figure 3. But this is for 2008 on Figure 6. And you can see in 2008, the fiscal arrangements were barely redistributive at all. It is almost the flat line I spoke of before, despite huge differences in per capita GDP, which have expanded wildly. Now, things change in 2009. Good, almost done. 2009, transfers were more redistributive, but in both years, the amounts going to each province is, so to speak, all over the map. That is, the R squareds are really low. Here it's 30%. And you can see BC, Quebec, Ontario are far below the trend line. Newfoundland is far above the trend line, as is as is PEI, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and interestingly enough, Saskatchewan and Alberta are right on it. So we're sort of all over the place. So the trend line, in fact, does not describe very well what is going on. Now, the two slides developed in this paper are proxy and imperfect measures for underlying features of our fiscal arrangements. Nevertheless, the results are very stark. They're so stark and unambiguous that the story they tell will stand up regardless of what measure are used. And you could try using a few different measures if you were interested. And the story that stands up is this. Over the last decade and a half, Canada's fiscal arrangements have become highly unfair and inefficient in correcting fiscal imbalance. The fiscal union, to the extent that it still exists at all, is in dire straits and failing. To answer the question at the beginning of this analysis, Canada is, for many intents and purposes, no longer a practicing fiscal union, at least in respect of using fiscal federalism to mitigate fiscal imbalance. How did we get here? Beginning with the large cuts in fiscal transfers in the mid-1990s, and even more so in the last few years, fiscal arrangements have been subjected to a series of one-off ad hoc political deals, unilateral cuts, ceilings, and so on. What began as fiscal arrangements built on a foundation of principle has over time been replaced by fiscal arrangements built on political expediency. Canada could go a long way to restoring the fiscal union by using its existing transfer funds more efficiently. The ad hoc deals of the last number of years would be difficult to untie, but untangling the mess, or at least stating an intention to do so, would begin to address some of the issue. So smarter spending of existing funds would be a start, but, and this is a big but, there's a quantitative limit to the size of redistribution through fiscal federalism in Canada. To offset fiscal imbalance more fully through fiscal arrangements would require not only spending what we have more efficiently, but increasing the overall amount of fiscal transfers relative to the size of the economy from maybe 4% to 6%. The paradox of Canadian fiscal federalism is that the federal government itself must provide the funds to correct for fiscal imbalances, but these are increasingly caused by natural resource revenue. So if the federal government were to increase substantially the amount of funds in the fiscal arrangements, it could only do so by collecting most of its federal taxes in the very provinces to which it must pay increased transfers, mainly Ontario and Quebec. And this obviously would do nothing to correct fiscal imbalances, and in fact, it might even make it worse. Thus, without measures to allow federal access to resource revenue, we're probably stuck at a limitation, a ceiling of 3 to 4% as the maximum amount that we can redistribute through fiscal arrangements. So just to conclude, given the limitations on the size of our transfer system, I would contend that it's all the more important that it be as fair and efficient as possible, but even that may be inadequate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. I'm glad to see you did address what is a generation gap in this room because you use PowerPoint. And the younger people are going to be delighted that you did that. It's a really great privilege to participate in this symposium and to be able to personally congratulate everybody who has to do with the Caledon Institute on its 20th anniversary. And with just so few players, that's what you've demonstrated. You've had such an enormous impact on so many dimensions of Canadian public life, and it's just great. My assignment today is kind of humbling to me because I stand here in the shoes of Keith Banting, my friend and colleague and a major contributor to the work of Caledon, who is unable to be with us today. I don't think we'd make quite the same comments about Michael's paper as I think we would differ a bit, but I think we'd have the same spirit. Michael's paper is done with his usual elegance, clear, incisive, driven by the data, and with graphs that are so clear that you barely need to read the text to know what he's saying here. And of course, as we saw, demonstrated Caledon's respect for the data. And he does have this very strong thesis that the Canadian fiscal union, to the extent it exists at all, continues, is in dire straits and failing us. In fact, we're no longer a practicing fiscal union. And he has these two sets of indicators to make his point. First of all, the fiscal weight of the federal government measured by federal spending as percent of GDP has steadily declined since the 80s, except for the modest tick up recently. I think actually Michael understates the case a little bit. I think this long-term trend of the relative decline of the federal government compared with the provinces has been going on for a very long time and across many different governments. I seem to recall, and I couldn't find it again, a number that said the year where the federal government had the highest proportion of public spending compared with the three levels was 1955. And it has declined at different rates, obviously, over therefore a long period of time. And it's important, I think, to try to understand why this happened. And it is indeed, in part, the result of the choices that individual governments of different parties and so on make, as with the Martin budget cuts in the 1990s, or Harper's austerity programs more recently, and so on. But I guess as a political scientist, I think that the drivers are more fundamental. They include the increasing importance of policy areas, health, education, welfare, which lie primarily in provincial jurisdiction. And Michael said we have a very watertight compartments model of federalism. And that, I think, combined with the end of the era of steady economic growth in the 1970s, with the growing preoccupation with debts and deficits, and so you had a federal government that begins to act under much more serious constraints, and the spigot wasn't open all the time. And of course, this decline of the federal government and the rise of the provincial share coincided with the growth of provincial assertiveness, primarily, as we all know, in the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, which took the whole growth of government to the provincial level rather than the national level, but in other provinces as well, which came to challenge federal hegemony, to see themselves as equal partners, not subordinate to the federal government, not needing to defer to it, and so on. And then along with all of that, if we think, why this decline of the federal government? We have the virtual demise of any nationally integrative party system. We don't have national parties, really, anymore. And if we don't have national parties, it's not very easy to bridge regional differences, and not very easy to have a federal government which can speak with power and legitimacy, and so on. So in some ways, the role of the federal government in the lives of Canadians has diminished. Not entirely, but we do have a much more regionalized society, economy, and party system, which does, I think, in the long run, significantly undermine federal authority and legitimacy. And of course, we also have much stronger global and international constraints on fiscal policy, the fiscal union. But does this add up to the demise of the fiscal government that Michael has described? And I think perhaps not quite. It's impossible for us to know, first of all, how big a proportion of public spending the federal government actually needs in order to have the kind of effects that Michael's looking for. I think it's a very hard question to answer. But if we look at Canada's performance through the recent global economic crisis and recession, it seems to me that we don't see government, and I'll use it to cover all government, in Canada as powerless and ineffective. Michael cites the disaster in the European Union, but we haven't fared anything like as badly of that, and we've done much, much better than most of our peers, despite our decentralized political system. So it turns out, and this is actually the result of a study that's going on at Harvard now on what's the effect of federalism on how a crisis is managed. And the answer seems to be that's really hard to pin down. First of all, I think in Canada, because the federal government probably does have more room than the provinces to raise revenues, even though they have virtually equal authority to do so. But I think provinces' fiscal autonomy is somewhat more constrained than Ottawa's is. Second, because the federal government still has its very broad power to spend, bail out car companies and all of this kind of thing. And again, with probably more room than the provinces have. Thirdly, because the fiscal union is not just spending and taxing, it seems to me, and the federal government has all these other tools at its disposal: monetary policy, banking, foreign trade and commerce. It's not powerless. And again, in the international arenas of the IMF and so on and so forth, the International Committee looks to the federal government, expects it to take the leadership role in these areas. And then finally, I think we've done sort of okay, and I'll only say okay. I don't make too much of a big thing of this, and I certainly don't want to speak in favor of many of these policies that we've followed. But we have had a surprising degree of federal-provincial cooperation through these recent difficulties. Provinces have generally, in the last few years, accepted federal leadership. Some of the tensions that we saw in earlier years have dissipated to some extent. Perhaps, again, because they all kind of shared some sense, yeah, we have some collective responsibility in this crisis. And we don't have, yes, there's lots of variation in provincial debts and spending and so on and so forth, but we don't have rogue provinces like Catalonia in Spain or various states in the United States, which indeed have very much increased the fiscal difficulties in some of those countries. So I would conclude on the first of Michael's two dimensions that the fiscal union is not perhaps quite as big a problem for Canada or Canadian federalism as he suggests. And again, given the nature of Canadian politics and the relative powers of the federal and provincial governments, we can't assume that the fiscal union is only the responsibility of the federal government. It's clearly the responsibility of both orders of government, because they both exercise such broad powers in this area. So fiscal union in Canada has to be a pretty much intergovernmental matter, difficult as that is. Michael's second dimension is about equalization and redistribution. How well are we meeting the commitment of Section 36 of the Constitution to ensure comparable levels of public services at comparable levels of taxation? Wonderful principle we put into the Constitution. Are we still a sharing federation? Are we still what Alan Blakeney called a giant mutual insurance company? Seems to be a nice way of thinking about Canadian federalism. And my own view is that equalization is one of the crowning achievements of Canada and Canadian federalism. And what it's done is kind of magical. It's allowed us to combine this incredibly decentralized political system with so much provincial variation, autonomy, discretion, etc., with a modicum of social justice and equality. Because what we said with equalization, if province A chooses something different from province B, that's not because province A is rich and province B is poor, because equalization is substantially, now it's less, Michael's right, and that's now than it was, but that is a great achievement, and Michael does show the same, and now I think very worrying decline in federal provinces to the transfers as a percentage of GDP. And more worrying is that starting in the 1990s, he showed us the equity of the transfer system as a mechanism deteriorated very badly too. And that figured when he says that there is no relationship between the money you get from Ottawa, transfer, and your GDP per capita. I mean, that's a very powerful indictment of a system which does seem to be operating, as Michael said, pretty much without principles. So this is a powerful step. What I'd like to see is this project go on much further. How much is what Michael has shown us showing up in variations in the nature and quality and extent of education and health and welfare across the provinces? Is there a serious exacerbation of those differences in the quality of programs that people are receiving? Logically, it would seem yes, but I don't think it's been shown yet. And then, of course, Michael mentions the other elephants in the room, the escalating revenues of Alberta and other resource-rich provinces. And indeed, I think it's a very real question. How can an equalization funded by the federal government without access to the revenues which generate the inequality in the first place, how can that survive? And secondly, how can it survive when now it's not just small provinces which got equalization, we're now the largest province is a big recipient of equalization. So we're kind of equalizing ourselves here in Ontario, and that's not rational either. Dire straits, therefore, indeed. Michael is right. That transfer and equalization policy has become politicized and ad hoc and arbitrary and so on and so forth. And rules and principles don't just seem to have much place anymore. But I've studied the negotiation of the fiscal arrangements at earlier periods in Canadian history and don't think there weren't politics in every one of those regular negotiations. Michael also calls for a more efficient transfer system. I'd like to know exactly a little bit more about what we mean by efficiency in that area. And then we come back again to the politics of it. I talked about the increased regionalization of Canadian politics. What are the implications of that for equalization? To what extent, again, do people feel that they must look to their province, to their provincial governments for equity and so on, aren't confident in the capacity or willingness of the federal government to treat all regions fairly and so on. One of the remarkable things in the public opinion surveys that I've looked at about equalization is how popular it remains, even in wealthy provinces. It's quite extraordinary. So there's a lot of traction, at least in public opinion, if not in the government, to this idea of sharing within the Canadian system. But is it under threat? Is it eroding? Over time, logically, it must, unless, again, it finds its defenders in the citizenry, in civil society, in organizations like yours, but also in governments at both levels. So this is a very difficult time, I think. Michael is right about that, perhaps not quite as bad as he thinks about it. And that leads me to my final point. Michael has carefully and judiciously, in his paper, limited himself to measuring and assessing the fiscal union, right? You can Google fiscal union and Wikipedia will tell you what fiscal union it is. But I think it's worth remembering that in Canada, in recent years, we've discussed several forms of union. Canada as a fiscal union, Michael, as a broader economic union, right? Royal Commission, MacDonald Commission, with a free flow of capital and goods and services. As a social union, we talked about that a little bit during Charlottetown and so on, asking whether we have a shared commitment to certain values in health, education, and so on. And most important, as a political union. We've used that union word in all these different contexts. And in every one of them, they're contested and they're debated, and we worry, at least to some extent. What I think would be a very, very useful exercise would be to try to see how all these dimensions of economic union are linked together, work together, or work against each other, and so on, so we can get a kind of a broader sense of the way in which this union working. That's a task for all of us, not just for Michael. But I do think it's important to realize as well that our union, let's say maybe not our Canadian union, but our Canadian unions, plural, are not and cannot be, because of Canadian history, Canadian Constitution, Canadian politics, Canadian economy, Canadian society, only and solely the result of federal action and responsibility. So the question then, the final sort of question is, if we accept that the union is a result of the work of all three levels of government, then how do we find some principled way of thinking what role each of them plays and how they relate to each other in the playing out of our union? Thank you.